Welcome to another Thursday night Bible study, brought to you as a ministry of SIGBC.
1 John chapter 5, verses 2 through 5, 9 through 13, 20 through 21, talks about the fact that the Son of God has come. And 1 John chapter 5, verse 11 says, "And this is the testimony. God has given us eternal life, and this life is in his Son." And so we know that the Son of God has come, and that's what we celebrate at Christmas time. In verse 20 it says, "We know also that the Son of God has come and has given us understanding so that we may know him who is true." So this is a testimony of John, the disciple of Jesus, as he looked forward to the return of Christ, having acknowledged his birth and then death, burial, and resurrection, and the salvation that's available through him. So John, at the end of his life, is writing 1 John, and he says, "This is a testimony, my testimony that I've seen as an eyewitness. God has given us eternal life, and this life is in his Son." Marilyn Adamson wrote about how she, as an atheist, found God several years ago. And so I'd like, at the beginning of our contemplation of the Son of God has come, I'd like to read her testimony in its entirety, because it's a personal account from an atheist who was convinced no God exists, and then the facts that led up to God. And she writes, "It seemed to bother religious people when I had asked them, 'How do you know God exists?' Perhaps they wondered about my motives, or maybe they had no idea how to answer. Most of their responses were, 'Well, you just know.' I wasn't trying to be difficult, but I certainly did not just know, and I was hoping someone did. After many months of this, I thought, here are the people who say they believe in God, but no one knows why. It was like learning the truth about Santa Claus. It seemed obvious that God was completely fabricated to her. Maybe some people needed to believe in God, but clearly there was no proof, no objective evidence. I came to the stark conclusion: God did not actually exist." And then she says, "I held this belief for years, not expecting to ever change. But then I met someone who caused me to become interested in the possibility of God. She was caring, kind, and very intelligent. It actually bothered me that someone that intelligent could believe in God. She talked about God like he was her closest friend. She was convinced he deeply loved her. I knew her life well. Any concern she would take to God, trusting him to work out a way or care for her in some way. She would tell me, quite candidly, that she was merely praying that God would act upon her concerns. For over a year, I regularly saw what seemed to be answers to her prayers. I watched her life through a myriad of circumstances, and her faith in God was unwavering. So I wanted to believe in God, on one hand, because I admired her life and her love for others. But I couldn't believe in something against my intellect, against my better judgment. God did not exist. A nice idea, but that was all. Wanting something to be true doesn't make it true." During this time, I was developing a personally built philosophy. I tried something that I'm not sure many people do. Every few weeks, I would study a particular philosopher's take on life. Nietzsche, Hume, Dostoevsky, Sartre, Plato, and then try to apply it to my own life. I was looking for the perfect workable philosophy for life. I found over and over that either their philosophies seemed lacking or were too impractical to actually implement. But I kept searching. I was challenging my friend with every question that came to mind about God. I would find myself writing out questions late in the evening, This went on for well over a year. One day she handed me a book that briefly answered questions like, is there a God? Is Jesus God? What about the Bible? It presented facts. No comments like, you have to believe. I saw some evidence for God that was solidly logical. The parts particularly convincing to me were the chemical properties of water and the Earth's position to the sun. It was all too perfectly designed, too perfectly put together. My faith in nothing behind it all seemed weaker than the possibility of God. I had fewer reasons to be certain of nothing and more reasons to conclude that God might be there. I then encountered a situation that fully changed my current philosophy on life. What I had been putting my faith in proved to be completely insufficient. It shocked me to see that I was at a loss for an approach to life that was fully reliable. However, the situation resolved itself and I moved ahead. I have a pretty steady personality. Throughout my life, I've never really felt needy. No ongoing crisis, no big gaps or struggles, and certainly nothing I felt guilty about. But the concept of God was something I couldn't get off my mind. Was he there? Does he exist? Maybe there is a God. One night I was talking to my friends, and I was talking to this particular friend again, and she knew that I had all the information I needed. She knew that I had run out of questions to ask. Yet I was still trying to debate. In one clear, abrupt moment, my friend turned to me and said, you know, I can't make this decision for you, and God's not going to wait forever. And I immediately knew she was right. I was playing around with a very important decision, so I went home and decided that I was going to decide. I was either going to ask God to come into my life, or I was going to end the subject forever and never allow myself to consider the possibility of God again. I was tired of dealing with the decision. I was tired of thinking about it. So, for the next 3 or 4 hours, I reviewed everything I'd read and observed. I evaluated it all. I concluded that the evidence for God was so strong that it made more sense to believe in God than to believe he wasn't there. Then I had to act on that conclusion. I knew that just intellectually concluding God exists was way too light. It would need to be like deciding airplanes exist. Faith in an airplane means nothing. However, if you need to get somewhere and an airplane is away, then you have to decide to act and actually get on the plane. Believing it exists is not enough. I needed to make the decision to actually talk to God. I needed to ask him to come into my life. After a few hours of thought, I addressed God. Okay, you win. I ask you to come into my life, and you may do with it whatever you like. It seemed reasonable to me that since God exists, God had every right to influence the direction of and to direct my life if he wanted to. I went to bed, and the next morning wondered if God was still there. And honestly, I kind of sensed that he was. One thing I knew for sure, I immediately had a huge desire to get to know this God, whom I now believed in. I wanted to read the Bible, and when I did, it seemed that God was spelling out who he is and how he viewed his relationship with him. I was amazed. It was amazing. What really surprised me is how often he talked about his love. I hadn't expected that. In my mind, I was simply acknowledging God's existence. I had no expectation of him. But as I read the Bible, he chose to communicate his love to me. That was a surprise. Well, one of the most famous and meaningful passages in the Bible that deals with the aspect of the Son of God has come is 1 John chapter 5. And so let's read very quickly verse 2 through 5, and then 9 through 13, and then verse 20 through 21. We'll just skip over a few areas and then contemplate what this actually means to us. We'll continue this study again next week, of course, as always, because we usually run out of time before we get to the end of the Bible study. This is how we know that we love the children of God: by loving God and carrying out his commands. In fact, this is love for God, to keep his commands. And his commands are not burdensome, for everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. Verse 9. We accept human testimony, as we just read the testimony of the atheist who became a follower of God. We accept human testimony, but God's testimony is greater, because it is the testimony of God which he has given about his Son. Whoever believes in the Son of God accepts this testimony. Whoever does not believe, God has made him out to be a liar. Why? Because they have not believed the testimony God has given about his Son. And this is the testimony. God has given us eternal life, and this life is in his Son. Whoever has the Son has life. Whoever does not have the Son does not have life. I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you may know that you have eternal life. Verse 20. We know also that the Son of God has come and has given us understanding, so that we may know him who is true. And we are in him who is true by being in his Son, Jesus Christ. He is the true God and eternal life. Dear children, keep yourselves from idols. So, 3 observations. We'll just make the first one very quickly and then continue this study next week. The first observation from verses 2 and 4 is that by faith in the Son of God, we overcome the world and learn to love one another. The world being the ideology and philosophy of this world that says you have to take care of you. You are the only one that matters in this life. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, these things in the world's definition are good. But God says no. God says this is how we know that we love the children of God: by loving God and carrying out his commands. And what are the commands of God? Back in chapter 2. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So we read, by faith in the Son of God, we overcome the world and learn to love one another in verses 2 through 4. This is how we know that we love the children of God: by loving God and carrying out his commands. In fact, this is love for God, to keep his commands. And his commands are not burdensome, for everyone born of God overcomes the world. He says, look, it may seem like a task to love God and obey him and to choose to give up self, deny self, take up our cross daily and follow him. But God's commands are not burdensome, because in the end we overcome the world. We are able to deny self and reject the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, and choose to love God and therefore obey, and choose in obedience to love one another. So, by faith in the Son of God, we overcome the world and learn to love one another.
Thank you for listening. You can also join us in person or live on Facebook every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Japan time. This has been a ministry of Sakahogi International Grace Baptist Church.